Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it about 20 seconds just to let everyone start to connect. But thank you for joining us on this lovely afternoon. Think we can go. Numbers are increasing. I've got lots of people joining all at once. Okay, welcome everyone to IAB Europe's TCF 2.2 webinar for publishers. Very happy to have you join us live today. We have put together a series of webinars for different stakeholder groups to help you fully understand the implementation. And we are fortunate to be joined by members of the TCF Steering Group who will be walking through some of the changes. Last week, we hosted a webinar for vendors and one for CMPs, and then today's one is for publishers. Now, we've produced a full FAQ document, which we released a few weeks ago, and we're going to be putting a link into the chat box so that you get access to all of the questions that you may have regarding the implementation. And then the aim of today is to hopefully delve a bit deeper and just go through some of those particular areas. Presentation will last about 20-30 minutes, may even be shorter. And then after that, we will have a Q&A for the audience. You'll see at the very bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. Any questions you have, please do put those in. And then my colleague Gosha will open the floor to our speakers and we can go through those. So with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague Gosha, who will then introduce our wonderful speakers for this afternoon. So over to you, Gosha.
Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. So I would like to also welcome everyone who has decided to join the webinar. I would also like to welcome and introduce our speakers of today. The panelists are the members of the TCF Policy Working Group, the group that works on developing and reviewing the TCF policies. And our speakers are going to give you the overview of the relevant changes for the publishers. So today we have Christoph Zippel, a senior legal counsel at RTL, who is also the chair of the TCF Policy Working Group, Robert Blank, general manager e-commerce and advertising at Axel Springer, and Peter Craddock, partner at Keller at Heckman LLP, who is our legal counsel, and he's going to join us during the Q&A session. Okay, may I ask? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the agenda. In the first play, we are going to show the timeline of the implementation for the TCF version 2.2. Then later on, our panelists are going to give the overview of the main changes for the publishers. We start with removal of the legitimate interest for some purposes. Later on, new purpose 11, improvements to the existing user-facing standard text, standardization of new information about vendors, disclosure of the number of vendors, publisher selection process of vendors, improved policies on withdrawal on consent, and at the very end, we are going to have, as Helen said, the Q&A session, and we are going to answer the questions live. If not, we are going to have, after this webinar, a special document with the questions that hasn't been answered during the webinar. So just if you have any questions, please feel free to just ask them. If we don't have enough time to answer them now, we are going to do it later. And the Q&A is going to be on our website. Also, before we start, I would just like only to pay your attention to the fact that this webinar, as Helen said, is a little bit limited when it comes to its scope. We had two more general ones some time ago, and about the policy changes and the technical specification changes. So both of the recordings are available on our website. So if you prefer to have or if you need the general overview of the changes, please go to our website, because this webinar is mostly focused on the changes for the publishers. So just a small disclaimer. Okay, may I ask for the next slide? Okay, thank you. So the launch of the TCF version 2.2 took place on 16th of May, and it contained the changes to the TCF policies as well as to the technical specifications that were developed together with the IAB Tech Lab. And the first important date for the publishers might be the June 30th, when the vendors need to update their registration details. And we require from vendors new informations that are going to be disclosed later on in the CMP UIs. Later, there's July 10th. It's actually the reminder to the CMPs that we are going to revoke the consensus.org subdomain. So it's really important for the publishers to make sure that the CMPs they work with, they apply this change. And September 30th is the deadline for supporting TCF version 2.2, which means basically that all the live installations needs to be in compliance with the new TCF policies and technical specifications. And maybe one more remark. Right now we have 2 global vendor lists. The new one is also available for the TCF version 2.2. So there are 2 GVLs that are live in the same time, but the current one for the TCF version 2.1 is going to be stopped together with the end of the implementation period. Okay, so I think now I can give the floor to our wonderful speakers. So I would like to ask Robert to present the next slide.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, and hello to everyone on the webinar. Yeah, there are some major changes in 2.2, and we wanted to show you the important ones today. Perhaps there are also some minor tweaks, as you know, in the policy, but the major changes we show. I think the most important and one of the biggest is the removal of legitimate interest for 3, 4, 5, and 6 purpose 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's creation and using of profiles for advertising, but also for the content part. Especially the content part was discussed during the policy phase, and but the decision and the action plan, as you know, for the RPD was an important step forward to say that we're trying to be more on the consent phase. What is important is, or what are the advantages, that there is now limited part of restrictions to the publisher controls, because beforehand a lot of publishers used restrictions to restrict the purposes from legitimate interest to consent, because some of the vendors were relying on both legal basis, as you know. And so this is now not needed anymore, because there's only consent possible. And the other one is that you can still use legitimate interest as a publisher, for sure. This does not, TCF cannot decide for a publisher which legal basis perhaps you can use for your own purposes or for some special relationship with other vendors you're having individually. So there you can still do that, but not under the umbrella of the standard TCF purposes. So there is still room for publishers, but this will be now cut off, the use of legitimate interest for this profile purposes. But we saw a problem. There is a new purpose because we saw that, as you know, there is purpose 2, which is basic ads, which gives the opportunity to use some of the in-moment data points, contextual information on non-precise geolocation data for, I don't want to say personalization, but based on real-time changes of advertising. But this was because of legitimate interest is not possible to use in content. And we needed something like the same for content as well, like purpose 2. So we came to the conclusion that purpose 11 is the way to go, because there's were some needs out of the market for some special vendors and also for some publishers to take use of that. And so we created purpose 2 in the same way that is used, limited data is used for select for content. So it's not able to create or use profiles, as we know. This was the purpose 5 and 6. And you should definitely check which vendors will take use of that, because it's a new purpose. So a lot of vendors perhaps need some time to adjust, to know what they can do and how they use purpose 11. We will see that in the next weeks or months, but you should check if that is a way forward, if you have very limited data you want to use for your content use cases with some of the vendors. Next slide. So one other major improvement is that, yeah, the names of the purposes, which were somehow by the RPD under critics. There were some features as well, which were not fully understandable at some points, and we're trying to tweak them into a new direction. And we also put away the legal text, because it was said that the legal text is not part of the user text, and so perhaps it's not part of the content itself. And so we merged it, that the new user text is also kind of the legal text. Only the user text is the one to go, and where all information to be transparent and transparent enough to be the right purpose. So what we put instead of it was also illustration, example, something in which is explaining the purpose in a practical way, so that people and users can understand what exactly that could mean. And these are now in there. These are very interesting, and I think they are helpful, that users, if they read it, they can better understand what this purpose is all about. We had a highly discussion about the requirements if publishers are able to change or modify these examples. 2 examples are per purpose, but now it's the possibility, there is a possibility for publishers to change one of these example/illustrations, but there is an important step. You have to signal that down chain to the vendors. The vendors then get that flag. Before we had customized stacks, as you know, there were also a flag. So the flag is now used for customized stacks and custom purposes. So if you change something to the standard, you can do that, but you have to signal that vendors are able to check if they want to work with non-standard texts. So you perhaps, if you want to do that, you change an illustration / example, then perhaps you should refer to vendors, because I know that some of the vendors were saying if there are coming custom ones, perhaps we don't want to take the risk that there is a custom illustration which is perhaps not what we all agree to each other, and this is why then we cannot take the request, for example, and have to drop it. So therefore, if you want to do that, you should reach out to your vendors to check if that's possible. But there is also a progress we discussed in the policy group, that if you have a customized example, you can bring this into the policy group, and perhaps we can accept that, amend that to new standardized texts or examples, which helps to improve at the end this part of the TCF, that it's a very big ecosystem, and a lot of vendors and publishers having very customized relations. So perhaps we need another point of view or angle to change them into the direction which is understandable, perhaps by different markets or with different use cases. So I think then I hand over to Christoph.
Thank you, Robert. So there's also standardization of new information about the vendors. So under 2.2, vendors are required to submit quite a lot of new information that can be with their registration, or it can be then displayed on the secondary layer of the UIs. And this includes categories of data, which follows a taxonomy, retention periods on a per purpose base, and also linked to an exploitation of their legitimate interest at stakes. So also vendors can have different URLs for their privacy policies on a per language basis. So what does that mean? Does that mean for the publishers? Publishers can now and should check with their CMP how these requirements and how they intend to build these disclosures. And also publishers can ask CMPs to provide their users a link to vendors privacy documentation in the language of the service, what they think is appropriate for your audience. And they may also choose not to work with vendors who do not maintain a privacy documentation in the language they intend to use. And this gives quite some transparency for the users, especially as there can be localized versions of privacy information. So next slide, please. Next thing is a disclosure of the number of vendors. And this is something which has really affects the publishers and CMPs and is new to the TCF standards. So under 2.2, CMPs and also the publishers with that are required to disclose the number of third-party vendors they the third-party vendors in the initial layer of their UI. And we have added an example here that which is usually in the introduction text of a CMP, where you say that we have our partners, and you would need, a publisher would need to put the number of partners that store and access information, in this case for personalized ads and content. And this is something really new, gives transparency about what a user can expect, how many third-party vendors may access their data. And on the secondary layer, there are there's more of a breakdown as the number of vendors are then needed to be showed on a per purpose basis for legitimate interest as well as consent. This should represent all the numbers of TCF vendors that a publisher or CMP has onboarded, but also may include non-TCF vendors, which would give I think the full picture of how many third parties are in there, and provides transparency so that a user can say how many third parties vendors will access their data, and can also see how many will do that per purpose. So a publisher, as well as commercial CMPs and publishers working with CMPs, are encouraged to compute this number automatically, and publishers should see how CMPs are doing that. Doing it manually would probably be complicated if you change something. And also publishers can see and need to decide for themselves how many vendors they would like to work with, since they display this on the initial layer of the UI. So this is like a really new thing, which will be on the initial layer. So next slide, please. And another addition is, no, I think this is you again, Robert, correct?
Yeah,
sorry.
I think it's
yeah.
me.
Sorry about
but you also can do that.
No, please go ahead.
So I think it's important that we saw in the past some publishers who are just importing the GVL. So because you're importing the GVL like 700-800 vendors, because perhaps some people don't want to miss some vendor, perhaps which is important for your revenue stream. So what we are now changing is that we get more information through the register process for vendors, that you can better select. In the GVL, we will have much more information about the vendor, especially about like the region, about like the use. Is that ad serving? Is that for brand suitability? Is that analytics? Is that whatever? There is a lot of more new information, which countries it's operating, because the GDL have a lot of vendors, but we have a lot of member states in the EU, and some of the vendors are only restricted to some very special countries. So it's important if you show the, we think that the number of vendors on the first page is something which you don't want to perhaps have 800 vendors there. So this is why you can perhaps make a better choice on which vendors you want to work with. And so in the selection process, you will have all this new information. You should definitely go for a due diligence process by yourself. You should check the vendors, you check the information they give, and you should, you should choose your vendors wisely, and perhaps reduce them on an amount which is better suitable and better in compliance for everyone. And therefore, you have a lot of more new information through this process of the new registration, where all vendors now, which were in 2.1, registered, you have to go now through the whole process again. No vendor will be accepted automatically. They have to go through this process. Everyone have to make the new registration, and perhaps the vendors will choose better information. And if you check and perhaps vendors were not really putting the right things into the registration and they're not chosen by publishers, it helps to put pressure on the compliance part, because then if they're not like taken or not on seeing reduced numbers, then they will encourage to make their compliance better. And I think that is good for the industry and for the TCF compliance overall. So it's your part of the publishers to do that. Yeah.
I think it's me again.
That's you, Christoph.
Yeah, so like one of the most important policy changes with effect to publishers is improved policies on withdrawal and consent. So the publishers need, and also the CMPs need to ensure that users can re-access the CMP easily to manage choices. This could be like an icon or a link, or something specific to an app, whatever works there and is easy. And in practice, this means that you need under 2.2 to have a call to action under which, if you have a call to action under which a user can consent to all purposes, which is very common, that you like have a accept all or consent all button. An equivalent call must be provided. Equivalent call to action must be provided when a user resurfaces the UI, something like a withdraw consent to all purposes and vendors with the same clicks, with one click when resurfacing the UI. This is something which comes from GDPR, because you have to withdraw consent as easy as you give it, and when you have the option to resurface and then do this withdrawal, this is as easy as probably as easy as giving a consent. It's really important that this does not mandate publishers to integrate something like a reject all button or refuse all button on the initial layer. This is not what this intends. It only says that you need to resurface the UI of the CMP and have this option there. Publishers should, of course, since some DPAs require this first layer button, be aware what their local data protection authority wants or requires, and act accordingly, of course, if they choose so. But the TCF 2.2 does not mandate this reject to all button. We had this question a lot in other discussions. It's not in the policies. Can be done, of course, but it's up to the publishers to decide how to implement the consent and withdrawal of consent dialogues. And it's also important to say that a withdraw button should also be there if publishers have implemented something like a paid access or paywall solution, such as the German Pure model, where you either consent or pay an amount not to be targeted or not to get any ads at all, but not to be have this tracking. So you still need to have a withdrawal, which would bring you back to the dialogue where you can access or pay, but you need to have the option to withdraw again. The standard is not asking for granularity here, that you can just withdraw some consents or some legal basis, but still needs to be accessible. It's not in the standard. I know that some DPAs are asking for that as well. What the standard says is that there needs to be an option to resurface that even under or also under this paid access model. Again, publishers should be aware what the local DPA's positions are on these points, because this is very different from DPA to DPA. So I think that's it with the main changes.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much for the great overview for the participants. Now we have the Q&A session. So we received some questions. The first one, how can vendors perform their purposes without storing accessing information on the user's device? So I think maybe I will ask Peter to answer to that, to give like the overview for about the purpose one.
Thank you, Josia. So indeed, the TCF includes a number of purposes that are basically a kind of categories that are based on what people are commonly using. So there's a kind of classification based on what the industry already does, and so it's a kind of taxonomy that combines all of these labels. But there's one purpose, the very first one, that actually is not viewed as a purpose from the perspective of data protection rules and so on, but it's basically seen internally as the kind of e-privacy and cookie related requirement. And so purpose one is there so that if you are storing information or reading information from a device, that basically it's the way that you declare that, that vendors are able to declare that, and so that then publishers can provide that information to users. And so if a vendor says, well, actually, I'm not using that, then they won't flag purpose one as being used. And so there are different techniques that are being used. Some of them are covered by purpose one, some of them are not. And so ultimately you have to decide, and this gets back to the point that Robert was making about making your selection of vendors. If you are working with a vendor that is not highlighting purpose one, then maybe you can ask them, what is it that you're doing, so that you can figure out whether that is something that you are comfortable with or not. But ultimately, there are techniques in practice that allow that. And so the TCF has the flexibility that if someone is going to signal purpose one, then that's doable. If they don't, then they have to find another way to do things.
Okay, thank you very much. The next one, which is recommended tool for cookie consent tool to be installed on the website? So we can't tell the precise tool which is the best for you. I think you need to do the research by yourself to see if like particular CMP is good for you, because each country has different requirements. So you just need to be sure that the certain solution is in accordance with your local DPA requirements.
I think there are a lot of CMPs out there, even the commercial ones. You can see that in the CMP list. It really depends on different markets. There are different market leaders in the market. There are enterprise. There are smaller ones for smaller websites, which are different. I think there is a really broad selection of CMPs out there, and it's for every publisher to make their choice. I think it's from the size of the publisher important, and then it's important the country is also sometimes, because some are very special in some countries, and the needs are sometimes a bit different, and the knowledge and the experience. So that is what I would suggest, to take a broader look.
I might add that that's something that Robert was mentioning in passing, but do look at the list, because this is what is important. The TCF is not saying this tool is better than this one, but the TCF is a standard that CMPs then choose to follow. And so CMPs that choose to follow the TCF, that choose to implement that, are appearing in a list. And so you go to the on the IAB Europe website, there is a section with the list of registered CMPs. And so this is where you start your analysis. And as Robert was saying, ultimately you choose which one is more appropriate. Some of them might have a stronger focus on pure websites. Some others might have a focus on different channels of communication, like your mobile applications and so on. So you really have to make your selection based on your use case.
Thank you very much. That's existing cookie consent tool requires an update for TCF 2.2. Currently, I'm using OneTrust. So again, it depends actually on the CMP you use, if they have implemented the changes for the TCF 2.2 or not. So you need to check if your CMP is in accordance with the new policies and technical specifications.
Ultimately,
the CMPs are working on
has
this.
to update. Every single one will have to update anyway, because there are changes that affect CMPs as well. And so some of the changes that have been mentioned, such as listing the number of vendors, this is something that has an impact on the interface. And so CMPs are updating this. And so last week, there was a dedicated webinar for CMPs. Before that, as Gosha mentioned, there were the general information webinars. And so that information has already been provided also to CMPs. And so they are busy doing this update now. You will then, as a publisher, get the updated version of your CMP. If you choose to stay with it, you can always change. But so do try to find out when the new version will be rolled out.
Okay, thanks a lot. The next one. Are there any plans for a standardized cross-CMP API interface to obtain the number of all vendors, including non-TCF vendors, to display them exemplary data in a privacy policy? Maybe you have some information, guys.
I think I know Claudius. He's from the German market. I think I'm not fully sure. To be honest, we have to double check. It's more a question of standardized APIs which are coming out of TechLab, or you mean the API which is coming from the standard JavaScript API on the browser. So I think the numbers of vendors is a setting which you have in the CMP. So I don't see a standardized cross CMP API. But perhaps if you have questions over there, let's please contact me, Claudius, you know me, and perhaps we can get into a deeper, and I can bring this into IAB or to TechLab if there are requirements on this one. But I don't know of any.
I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question right. Maybe let's ask if there's something like automatically adding it to the names of the vendors to a privacy policy. That's the second part, that you have like the transparency from the CMP layer, which is then added to the privacy policy. It doesn't exist to my knowledge, but we can maybe discuss this in a policy working group session or something like that. Yeah. That's like a feature that's being asked for.
Okay.
I can anyway also add that this is not a question that was raised by CMPs during their session. So I do not think there are any plans also at the level of the industry itself, beyond the question of the working groups themselves.
Okay, thank you. The next one, maybe Christoph can answer. Is it optional to name the number of non-TCF vendors?
It is. Well, from a policy point of view, of course, non-TCF vendors are not included, because this is the TCF, and this is not governing non-TCF vendors. Publishers need to see if they have full transparency when they do not name the numbers of non-TCF vendors, because there is some vendors missing then. But it's publisher's choice. We can also only say here should be TCF vendors, and can be non-TCF vendors, as this is allowed under the TCF 2.0. So to say it policy-wise, yes. Transparency-wise, probably not, unless there's like other ways to communicating it, because you're not giving the full picture.
Perhaps just to add, this is a really important point. It is up to you to make that decision as publisher. You decide whether the number you are going to be displaying is going to be only for TCF vendors or for everyone. But as Christoph is hinting, if you only show the number of TCF vendors, and I, as a user, I'm looking at that and I see, for instance, let's say I see 400 or I see 50. It doesn't matter. What I see a number, and then I see a full list, 50 additional ones, then that is going to have this is going to raise questions regarding the expectations of the individual. And so it's really important for you to have for your own purposes, full transparency over what you are doing. But it's also important, we know from this is something that authorities are going to be looking at very carefully. We know that it is important for you to be consistent as well. So the TCF cannot require you to list non-TCF vendors because that is not part of the scope of the TCF. But obviously, it is highly recommended.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there a way to communicate to vendors about data subject request for deleting through a string? Okay, so I think Peter or Robert maybe can answer.
Go ahead, Robert.
I think at the moment there is no solution from the TCF itself for communicating data deletion requests, subject requests. That's not part, but it was always discussed, and this is always a discussion inside the TCF policy working group and other groups, that there is also a need for in this direction. Perhaps that's for the future left to improve at one point TCF, but at the moment there is no possibility inside the string to signal any data subject request.
But to a certain extent, I don't think that this level of communication is going to be required because of a new change from a technical perspective. That is the requirement to basically collect real-time data. And so there is, as part of the more technical specifications, there's a requirement to use event listeners if you're using JavaScript. So this is a way of ensuring that when data is being read about a TC string, when a TC string is being collected, that it's an up-to-date one. And so if a user has changed their choices, that basically the vendor then sees an up-to-date one, that they are informed because they are basically constantly reading real-time data and not storing old data. So from that perspective, there shouldn't be a need to communicate a withdrawal because the vendors themselves are under an obligation to go check what the real-time value is.
Thank you very much. How is IAB supporting the due diligence process for vendors? Where do we find out which vendors operate in a given market? Okay, so together with the TCF version 2.2, we require now more information from vendors that are going to be disclosed in the global vendor list, but also there is one additional global vendor list where you can actually find the information exactly about the scope that certain vendors are working. So you just need to refer to our global vendor list, and there you can find all the information. Maybe if I check it quickly, I can put on link to the chat, so it will be there soon. Okay, the next one. If users do not consent to purpose 1, but do consent for purpose 3, 4, 5, 6, would that essentially enable purpose 1?
That's an easy question. It does not. It should not. Definitely should not do this, because automatically enabling of purposes should not work. And purpose 1 is a very special e-privacy directive purpose, which is separate by itself. And if it's not there and it's not sended over, it should not be enabled at all. So it's very clear that there is no. If you only got 3, 4, 5, and 6 and no 1, then the vendor most of the time do not work. Most of the time, I don't know. There should be use case where it does still work. What Peter was referring beforehand, but normally it don't.
It's also important to know that authorities themselves are going to be looking at that.
Yeah.
Because we saw from the separate discussion regarding the Belgian Data Protection Authorities case that one of the points they were highlighting was specifically information about whether, for instance, technologies like cookies are being used. That this is a concern for them, that they are looking at what level of transparency is being given to the users, to the end users. Are they seeing that a specific kind of technology is used in this context or not? So if a vendor does not select that, then an authority could be in a position to say, well, actually, you are not being transparent about how you are processing that information, basically about the means themselves. It's not about the purposes, like I said, because purpose one isn't really a purpose from that perspective, but it's really about transparency about the means.
Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you very much for the explanation. Should the information provided by vendors, example data categories of data retention periods, be disclosed on the second layer per vendor and per purpose? Maybe I can ask Christoph.
Yeah, because it is, of course, per vendor, because every vendor has different has different categories of data, probably different retention periods. Vendors are, of course, under the purpose, but you cannot make a setting per purpose here because it's like what the vendors have declared.
Okay, thank you. When and where local language and user-friendly text can be found? I think here the question is about the translation.
Mm.
Yeah, so we are working on it. So currently, I think it's going to be reviewed by the local IABs. So we are going to publish the translation soon. Can you please share more information, maybe some examples of the illustrations? So maybe Peter?
They are in the illustrations are
standard.
in the policy. So the policy document, I think it's also send it here. There is a long document on the website, which is the actually version of the TCF policies, and there are every purpose by every illustrations is in there, really easy to find. Perhaps we can send the link also in the chat here, but it's really easily, and then they're all purposes from 1 to 11, the features, the special features, and there's all descriptions in there. It's easy to read, and always happy also to get feedback. Yeah, but it's the one which is now the decided one through the policy group and through the steering group as well. So that will be the version we are now working on.
Yeah, and as Robert has said, the illustrations are kind of a work in progress because we might add new ones, might add to the new ones to the standard if they are brought to the policies working group. Those are the ones that we have discussed at length with several stakeholders, what could be fitting use cases, very common use cases for each purpose, and those might change or might be added in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Do you have a good example of how TCF 2.2 will look on the website with examples of multi-language privacy policy and user-friendly description and other stuff? I think, like, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think someone really implemented like fully the TCF 2.2.
I haven't seen one, so it's will be interesting to see which CMPs will do that in the first place. As I can just share the experience, which was like in the first instance when we released version 2.0, there were like a lot of CMPs making it differently. A lot of people, others were learning from the others. It's were different in countries. And so it's the TCF itself should not be totally fixed. Everyone should try to find his way, which is the best way for user experience, transparency, and so on. And then there was a movement to a more standardized approach, which most of the CMPs did it the same way or almost the same way. but it's not the role of the IAB to really do it precisely. So this is like an implementation example. It should be by the industry to find a way through the policy, who are also, there were CMPs working with the policy team inside the working group, but to find a way to do it best, but to comply with the TCF, because out of the sudden, if more people are working with each other and different stakeholders are trying their way, different UX and UI designers trying their way, perhaps there is the best way, but this have to be found out by the industry.
And to add to that, there's probably no one-size-fits-all solution, because we have so many different regulation, local regulation. Can only speak for Germany, where we have the 16 DPAs who have different opinions about how a CMP should look like. So that's why we could not or cannot give like a best practice example, because that might be okay with one DPA, but others might see it different. This might evolve over time, as Robert had said. But the TCF gives the flexibility to adopt to your local requirements. But of course, I think it would be, as Robert said, would be the same with the 2.0, that everyone somehow learns from each other, and there might be quite of a de facto standard, but still, we probably cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution.
Perhaps just to add that specifically on the issue of multi-language, I think many of us can imagine a website where you click on somewhere and then you switch the language. And the idea, I assume, would be that most of the CMPs that would be implementing some kind of multi-language option would allow that kind of flexibility, that when you change the language somewhere, that it's going to change the language of the entire interface. And so then that where I see normally a link to a specific privacy statement in a specific language, suddenly it's a link to the same document, but in another language. And so ultimately, it's going to be about making sure that the data subjects, the users of these websites, of these applications and so on, are able to access the information in a language that is consistent, ideally, with the interface. But this is, as both Robert and Christopher have said, this is going to be dependent on how the CMPs choose to implement that. And ultimately, you are also, as publishers, the customer, and you are able to decide which is the way that it should be implemented specifically on your platforms.
Thank you very much, guys, for the explanations. Hi, team. Can you inform IAB Europe's TCF framework for GDPR registration? Please share the step-by-step with us and the registrations links. I think someone asked here for how to register for TCF, unless I'm not sure I understand the question.
But it's register.consensus.org. I think that's the register. Perhaps everyone can go to the register page and take a look on how the vendor registration looks like.
But publishers do not need to register. They can only can just use the TCF. Can choose a registered CMP and use TCF. There's no registration requirement for publishers.
I think it's I posted it also in the chat, register.consensus.org, and there's a global vendor registration 2.2, and everyone can take a look how this looks like if there is interest.
Okay.
For publishers, if they're interested in how the vendors have to do that.
Yeah. Okay. The next one, you mentioned that publishers are free to rely on their legitimate interest for data processing purposes. They pursue as a data controller personalized of content because this is not covered by TCF policies. Please explain how is this applied by the vendors? The vendors should rely on the actual LI of the publishers. So maybe Robert.
So normally it's the TCF and the vendors saying how on which legal base they rely on, and you're working with vendors in the TCF, and this is a standard. So you have publisher controls where you can, if the vendor work on both legal bases, consent and legitimate interest, you could restrict that if you want to restrict as a publisher this legal basis. But there is a world outside TCF for most of, especially the enterprise publishers like also Axel Springer, we have a lot of vendors which are directly bilateral in a relation, which are not based on TCF, because we have a very direct relation. There is no chain, and there is a very special relation with that vendor. And if you are having this relation, you can also do in your CMP legitimate interest special, say a custom purpose, which is by your means, by your definition, how you want to work with a vendor. Perhaps you make an own purpose, and then you can rely on which legal base you ever want, which your CMP is supporting. But this is a special relation which is outside the TCF, and this is not stopped by the TCF, because we know that there is always a world which is perhaps more complicated, which cannot be standardized, and this way is always open. But if you are in the TCF, you have to rely on the legal bases which are in the TCF standardized, what the vendors want, or you can restrict parts of this, which are still based on the standard, to change off some of these. So perhaps if a vendor is relying on legitimate interest and consent, you can say, I only want to work on consent, and this is a publisher restriction, which is workable by the CMP. So I think that's hopefully the answer.
Maybe
to go ahead.
Please go ahead. Maybe to add to that, this is can be even more simpler, because publishers are doing a lot of data processing on their own. And they can rely on every legal basis that they deem appropriate for that. This is outside the TCF and is not in any way regulated or not in any way but this does not give it's not applied in any way to a vendor in the TCF. It's just
for example, social
yeah.
embeds. Social embeds are most of the time custom purposes, more or less. And most of the time, a lot of publishers have these ones outside, but yeah, everyone can decide for themselves. Yeah.
Or also content recommendation or whatever you use on your publisher side, which does not go in any advertising chain, or it's not.
Or even your own controllership. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's the last question. Looking at the specifications, and there are no examples or links to see what are the current recommended illustration, which should reflect each purpose. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong place. Yeah, maybe we weren't clear enough, because the illustrations are a part of the descriptions of the purposes. So you need to refer to the TCF policies version 2.2. I can send the link as the answer to your question.
The link is correct. You have to scroll down a bit more when there is the real purpose discussion. This is more a table then. You see it purpose 4, for example, number, user-friendly text, illustrations. And there you find it. It's not in the, so there is the policy and then starts the purposes.
Robert, the link actually is wrong. It's about like the description of the upcoming changes. So it's just put the link to the policies. So you need to scroll down through the policies to Appendix A, and at the very beginning, there are like the descriptions of the purposes, and inside you have the examples of the illustrations. So there you can find the illustrations.
But the link was correct. Policy doc here, so it's in the chat. But
yeah, but it was in the question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I think it's all. We don't have any more questions. So Helen. I don't know what happened with Helen.
I'm here. I'm just trying to see if we did have any other questions coming through, and we've gone through everything, and we have indeed. So as we said at the very beginning, I have been in the background copying and pasted every single one of those questions that were asked today. We will reflect any new ones in the FAQ document that we did share at the beginning. All of the links to the webinars and to the presentations that Christoph and Robert walk you through today will be sent to everyone that registered for this webinar, and we'll also be uploading those into our website tomorrow underneath our Knowledge Hub, and also the resources page for TCF 2.2. So thank you so much for attending. We do appreciate it. If you do have any additional questions, you can always contact us at framework@iabeurope.eu. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much. Big thanks to Robert, to Peter, Christoph, and to Gosha.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Cheers. Bye.